Dear friends, good afternoon. We expected Lord Skidelsky, but we thought he would come to another seminar. But because our situation is becoming more drastic, he has decided to come now at this seminar to support us. Keith will no doubt correct me because he knows so much more about Britain than I ever will. But still, let me make this introduction. I think that Robert was granted this title, His Lordship, when he authored his monumental work on Keynes, which was not only a bestseller in the Anglo-Saxon world, but it also became a bestseller in the Russian world. We published it about 10 years ago. This was a somewhat abridged version. And this is a text that I recommend all of our colleagues and friends. It's a biography, and at the same time a biography of philosophical currents, movements, and tenets. A biography of a person who believed that the political establishment must be closer to the intellectuals to help each other with the rationale. When the crisis of 2008 struck, Robert, together with Keynes, were in high demand worldwide and in Russia in particular. The work which gained such a recognition that he was made a lord. I was present for the presentation of the third volume, attended by the Prime Minister. And I suddenly saw and heard that this work was a fruit of 28 years of labor, of intellectual labor, in a world which is so, one may say, oversaturated with information and so much going on through the social networks. And I'm not trying to criticize the age. This is the age we're in now. But one should still remember that apart from the interjections and the collocations which people exchange wildly in the social networks, let me still draw your attention to the importance of fundamental studies, because this is what, after all, remains in the treasure trove of humanity. And the interjections and the little phrases, they die away, they fade away. Even if one is not and has not been endowed to write a book, one can still become a reader, and a talented reader, because the books are written to be read. Robert is an accomplished author of a number of studies and articles. We published his Enough is enough. I am not sure what was the Russian translation. We published his presentations and his interventions during our seminars. We are credited for discovering Robert for Russia. After we did that, the governmental circles started to avail themselves in Russia, started to avail themselves of inviting him. You know, finding an intellectual lord was such a big thing. No. And he is one of the most influential thinkers in Britain and in the world today. And it is my great pleasure to introduce him to you.
As always, I'm overwhelmed by your words of introduction. It's lovely to be back at the school. I'm a very, very keen supporter of the Moscow School of Civic Education, and I will do everything I can in my power, which isn't much, to make sure it goes on and continues its good work for Russia and for everyone. What I want to do now is just to give you some impressions of a strange set of events which took place at Sochi in October, and in which I was involved. Now, I don't know how much you know about the Valdai Discussion Club. It was set up 10 years ago by, I suppose by the Russian government ultimately, but it was to bring together Russian and foreign experts and journalists to talk about international relations. Each year there would be 2 or 3 days of discussions which would culminate in a dinner hosted by President Putin at Sochi on the Black Sea. Now, the anti-Russian Western media were very quick to call the foreign participants Putin's useful idiots. Они пригласили этого идиота.
And so they have invited this idiot.
Членом.
And this was the second.
At which I was there. Now, we met on the 21st to the 24th of October in the wonderful mountain ski resort outside Sochi. It was built for the Olympic Games. It was empty, except for us, except for the useful idiots. I don't know how they're going to fill it. Maybe with sanctions, which will make it more, and the falling ruble will make it more expensive for Russians to take their holidays abroad. More people will use these facilities, which is certainly wonderful. But at that time, there was no one there. And the topic of the meeting was the world order, rules or no rules. It took place in the shadow of Western sanctions. So it was an important event. It was a good moment to talk about the rules of the international system and of Russia's place in the international system. This time, the big boss, Putin, chose to address the assembled idiots from the podium rather than giving us dinner, which he had in the past. He delivered a 1-hour attack on the United States for wanting a world based on power, its own power, rather than a world based on rules. We also had a chance to meet and question a number of Putin officials, including Volodin, Lavrov, Ivanov, Shuvalov, and in what was perhaps an excessive display of loyalty to Putin, Volodin said, "Putin is Russia, and Russia is Putin." I asked Volodin when Russia was going to get a real democracy rather than a upravляемая demokratia. And he said, what are you talking about? We have a real democracy, he said. We have the most real democracy in the world, because all public officials are elected, and they're not all elected in England, are they? For example, the House of Lords. You're not elected. So, you see, we didn't get very far further along that line. Now, let me say something about Putin's speech. I think it followed a very well-known narrative of events, which went as follows. When Putin became president, he had offered America sincere friendship in the joint fight of Western civilization against Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism. Instead, America and its allies, claiming victory in the Cold War, had been pushing the EU and NATO into Russia's historic homeland, infiltrating not just Russia's space, but its core values. And as he was saying all this, Putin sounded like a rejected lover. He had wooed the United States, and the United States had turned against him. And a 3-hour question and answer session followed this speech. He answered questions for 3 hours. And he was occasionally lively, but mostly listless. Listless, what would you say is the Russian word for listless? Not very animated. Listless. Listless, not animated. And discursive, rambling. He didn't give very concise answers to the questions. His face was frozen, as though it had been heavily made up. And he seemed exhausted. I asked him this question. You want to restore Russia as a great power. A great power requires a great economy. But in 13 years of your rule, including Medvedev's presidency, you have failed to modernize the Russian economy. It's still largely dependent on energy and on volatile energy prices. What steps are you going to take, this is me, in your current term of office to diversify the Russian economy, to make Russia an attractive place for Russians to invest in, and not send their money to London, where they drive up house prices to an insane level? So that was my question to Putin. He gave a long reply in which he talked about many things, but I didn't actually feel he answered the question. And I don't think he could answer the question, really, because he couldn't say, look, I agree with you in theory, but my whole system depends on not modernizing the Russian economy. So he couldn't say that, so he said many things instead of that. Now, Ukraine was the main topic of the meeting, obviously, international relations. And one advantage of being at Sochi was to hear the Russian side of this put in a way which we very rarely hear in the Western media, because the Western media is very, very anti-Russian on the subject of Ukraine. As the Russians tell it, an illegal coup against democratically elected government of President Yanukovych brought extreme nationalists and fascists to power in Kiev on 22nd of February. This forced the Russian communities in the Crimea and in Donbass to organize in self-defense against persecution and even massacre. Russian volunteers from across the border came to the help of their beleaguered brothers. Crimeans voted to join Russia, and in annexing Crimea, Russia was carrying out the democratic will of the people of the Crimea. Now, the center of this narrative is the nature of the coup. This is absolutely crucial, I think, and everything, all the differences follow from this. In Russian eyes, it was the fascistic and nationalistic nature of the coup, and particularly the role of the right sector and one or two other groups, which made it necessary for the Russians to intervene to protect fellow Russians in Ukraine. In other words, the rhetoric, and especially the notion of fascist, which is very, very resonant in Russian memory, it was a rhetoric of a great patriotic war, a small war, a very small-scale war, but the same kind of threat, existential threat against Russians in the Ukraine. And in answer to a question, well, it was fascinating, this is a very interesting reason to be there. In answer to a question, Putin gave a fascinating account of a telephone conversation he had had with Yanukovych on the 21st of February. And Yanukovych rang him up and said, look, I've got this agreement with the opposition, brokered by the foreign ministers of France, Germany, and Poland. And basically, we form a government of national unity. There are going to be elections within a few months. And meanwhile, there's a truce in the Maidan. The police will not take offensive action, and the opposition have agreed not to abide by this agreement. They can remain there, but they can't occupy government buildings. And Putin said to Yanukovych, that's good, but you must stay in Kiev, and you must not withdraw the police from protecting government buildings, and including parliament. And then Putin told this story at some length. And then he said the next I heard was Yanukovych had fled from Kiev, all the police had been withdrawn, the opposition, the more violent opposition, had occupied parliament, and then the deputies had voted by 328 votes to 0 at the point of a gun, he said, to depose Yanukovych on the grounds that he was no longer fulfilling his duties, having left the capital. And so that is really how the Russians have seen these events. The West, on the other hand, sees a completely different story here. They regard most of this as sort of just delusional delusions by the Russians, where the Russians talk of a nationalist coup orchestrated and financed by the European Union and the United States, which is what they do. The Western media and policymakers see a popular uprising against a corrupt, despotic, and increasingly violent government. Now, there may have been, of course, extremist elements, and there may have been all this sort of stuff on the margin, but they say basically it was a revolutionary uprising. Whereas Russia talks of Russian volunteers coming in to help the threatened Russians in the Ukraine, the West sees Russia as invading the Ukraine, its armed forces as invading the Ukraine in an opportunistic attempt to recapture bits of the Ukraine for the old, which were part of the old Soviet Union, and more practically to stop Ukraine pivoting its economy and its politics on the West. In short, both sides accuse the other of deliberately manipulating Ukraine domestic politics for its own advantage. These are two opposite narratives, and there's very little connection between them. And the facts, even the very, very basic facts, are not agreed, which is of course, very frustrating for a political scientist or someone interested, professionally interested in getting to the truth of things. The truth, of course, is more complicated. As the former Czech president Václav Klaus pointed out in an incisive essay, the state of Ukraine today is a sad outcome of Stalin's attempts to mix up nations and boundaries, disrupt historical ties, and create a new Soviet man by turning original nations into mere ethnical, residual, and historical leftovers. Now, I think to an outsider, the predominant fact about the Ukraine is that it remained illegitimate, that state, to a lot of its own population. There was no common Ukrainian identity was created since 1991. There was no political transformation. Democracy has been a sham, with disputed elections and messy power transfers between oligarchic clans who use them simply as an opportunity to redivide property. In the economy, wealth is concentrated in the hands of a very small oligarchic class, and the economy itself is in a state of stagnation, industrial decay, high unemployment, and of course since the events of this year it's been collapsing very, very rapidly, about 8 or 9% drop in output. So, of course, Ukraine was ripe for manipulation by interested parties. As a state, it was too weak to resist being manipulated. And both sides did manipulate it. I mean, the Russians manipulated the politics in order to keep Ukraine in a Russian orbit, if you like, and the West manipulated its politics in order to pull Ukraine more towards the European Union, though not to NATO. I think NATO is a bit of a Russian delusion, but they did really want Ukraine in the European Union, or wanted to attract Ukraine to the European Union. Now, this brings us back to my last big topic, which is what is Russia's place in this world, the world in which are there rules, are there no rules, what principles determine the order that is emerging. It's obvious from Sochi and everything else that Russians have felt deeply humiliated by the Western victory in the Cold War and the destruction of the Soviet Union as a geopolitical balancer. That sense of humiliation is there in all official pronouncements, and it takes the form of denial. We did not lose the Cold War. We gave up voluntarily because of our love of freedom. We realized it was wrong to keep countries under control, which they didn't want to have, so we voluntarily gave it up. And instead of being praised for doing this, we were trampled on. I think that's a natural reaction for a denial. It's called denial, but I mean, in the West, it's very, very clear Russia gave up because it couldn't afford to continue this particular type of conflict. And so the Americans then started to talk about a unipolar moment, a unipolar world. The other pole was gone. And against that, the Russians advanced the doctrine of multipolarity, isn't that what it's called? And I quote Putin at Munich in 2007. He says, "The unipolar world did not take place. There is no reason to doubt that the economic potential of the new centers of global economic growth will inevitably be converted into political influence and will strengthen multipolarity." That's a direct quote from your president at Munich in 2007. Now, I think it's important to remember that at first, multipolarity didn't imply hostility to the United States. It was really a doctrine of partnership. They were looking for a strategic partnership with the United States, as I said, against a common set of common threats. And Putin took this quite seriously. Overruling his military, he gave unconditional support to American intervention in Afghanistan. He closed down military bases of Russia in Cuba and Vietnam. He allowed American access to Russian bases in Central Asia. He agreed to America's request to lower the oil price in order to help Russia at that moment. And it was only because he felt the payoff from these gestures was so small. He'd used up a lot of political capital with his own military in order to help the United States, and what did he get? Nothing. He thought nothing at all. Russia wasn't offered a fast track into the WTO, which is what he had hoped for. It was not offered a meaningful security role in NATO. In fact, Russia made overtures either to join NATO or to try and transform NATO into a wider security organization. That was all rejected. America restarted the arms race by abrogating the anti-ballistic missile treaty and so on. And so you then got this tit for tat, which is going on now. Russia retaliated by joining Germany and France in opposing the Iraq war. And whenever possible, Russia's tried to create its own coalitions against the Americans, against American-run institutions, most recently in Brazil, with new rival economic institutions. And you can see the change of attitude in the writings of Dmitry Trenin, who's been to this school, and he's one of the foremost Russian analysts, foreign policy analysts. In 2001, he was looking forward to a quasi-alliance between Russia and the United States. By 2006, he was lamenting the decoupling of Russia from the West and the so-called reset of Obama and Medvedev in 2008 got nowhere at all. So you have this decoupling. Instead of the strategic alliance, you have a slow decoupling and a process of estrangement. Now, I think as a normative proposition, multipolarity has a lot to be said for it. I'm a multipolar person. No single power is wise enough, strong enough, disciplined enough to claim a universal sovereignty. And the American-led attempt to export democracy by force, if necessary, has created a shambolic situation in much of the Middle East, with worse to come in the Middle East. So a better appreciation of the diversity of the modern world to which President Putin referred would have been very good for America and would have saved the world from many, many errors and mistakes in foreign policy. But it was plain from Sochi that the Russian leadership cannot grasp the fact that they're not in a position to negotiate a strategic partnership with the United States or the West. They're too weak. They fail to appreciate that the United States is in a position to choose whatever partners it wants. And that, it can't be admitted that to be a fact. It's too powerful, the United States. Still, even now, maybe the age of the America is changing, is coming to an end, but at the moment, the United States is the only global power. It is an indispensable element in every regional balance of power. You have the United States, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in East Asia, whether it's in the Middle East. It's always there, the United States. And that is the fact against which Russia has to find its way and discover a place in that kind of world. Now, it's not helping itself in many ways to do that. First of all, there's a huge contradiction between Russia's grandiose geopolitical ambitions and an economy based on raw material extraction. That is usually a third world type of economy. Russia is extraordinarily dependent on the price of oil. And as we see, the whole budget is totally deranged if the price of oil goes down, and also, of course, the ruble. Leave aside sanctions, which have been another cost, but you see how vulnerable Russia is. Gorbachev's attempt at perestroika in the 1980s was ruined by a collapse in the price of oil. Now, here is an economy that strives to be a major player in the world, and it's dependent, it's vulnerable to this. This is a huge vulnerability. And what, of course, Russia should have been done, and this was the point of my question to Putin, by now there should have been a great diversification into high-tech areas, very, very massive ones, with a lot of investment in modern infrastructure, and so, not on creating wonderful places like Sochi, I mean, which is wonderful, the Olympic Games, and of course it's symbolically very important, but the money spent then could have actually been invested in much more high tech, which would have made Russia less vulnerable, yes? So that was a mistake. Mistake priorities, two things in contradiction to each other. Second mistake, Russia, or Russian leaders, simply don't understand how offensive some aspects of Putin's healthy conservatism, or red orthodoxy, as Lena described it to me, is to all that liberal opinion in the West, which is instinctively pro-Russian. There's a huge amount of pro-Russian feeling in the West, but that's antagonized by some of these what seem to us to be very retrograde and even paranoid reactions to the fear of encirclement. And, I mean, the foreign agent law, I mean, the laws against gays, I mean, the attacks on various civil rights, and all these things seem to us to be paranoid and justified in the name of a false religious ideology, an invented religious ideology, which is now the basis of healthy conservatism. Does it spring, I have a question, do most of these measures spring from a deep sense of Russia in the Russian people, that they feel that they're under attack from these subversive forces from the outside? Is that the feeling to which Putin is responding, or is he inventing this? I'm really interested to know what you think about this, because I don't have an answer to that. Similarly, is Eurasia is the Russian alternative to full membership of European Union, or, full collaboration. Is Eurasia a myth? Is it a phantasm? I mean, is an economic unit that consists of Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Armenia, is that a real counterweight to this vast economic powerhouse, which is still the European Union, even though it's at the moment rather stagnating? Are these fantasies? Are they reality? If Russia leaves the Western orbit, who is its partner going to be? China is always regarded as the main one. But what is the sympathy of spirit or interest or history between Russia and China? Is China a replacement for England, France, Germany, Italy? I mean, if you're talking of different civilizations, surely there's a bigger gulf between Russia and China than between Russia and Europe. And yet Russian policy is driving in that direction. Anyway, I've more or less come to the end. Sochi, so I left Sochi feeling depressed, and also getting an overwhelming impression that the Russian leaders themselves were putting the best face they could on not a very good story they had to tell. They were smiling to keep up their spirits. I asked Lavrov, I said, what do you think will happen in Ukraine? He said, well, I hope that we'll get a negotiated restructuring of the Ukrainian state. Those were his exact words. And I said, if you don't, He said, well, I don't know. It'll be bad. But they're not going to get that, are they? I mean, the lines are hardening along the armistice line of September the 19th. Two states are in effect in existence. There's the Donetsk Republic is a state. It's a de facto state. It has its own banks, it has its own post office, it has its own government offices, and the Ukrainian government no longer tries to provide public services for that area. Therefore, it's supported by Russia, but it is a de facto separate state. How is it going to be reunited? And what's going to happen to the rest of the Ukraine? Well, freed from the eastern, or many of the eastern provinces, but that's unstable anyway, because there are lots of Russians still outside this separatist republic who might want to join in due course. So that's unstable, but for the rest of the Ukraine, the majority who are on the west side, they'll be free to join closer to the European Union, and even maybe in the end to NATO. So Russia will have lost its leverage on this big territory. So I felt the Russians didn't have a very good story to tell. Sanctions, when I asked, what about sanctions? Well, sanctions, the Russians have endured. Think of the Second World War. They don't need all this stuff from the West. They don't need this imported food, and they don't need capital. Well, Russian capital will develop Russia. And probably Russia will stagger on in a mediocre state, neither very successful, nor really failing, neither devil, nor pure in heart, proud of its values, semi-permanently estranged for many years to come from the United States and Western Europe, resentful, but not, extremely aggressive, certainly not, until it starts to feel more at home and calculates more realistically what its place is in the 21st century, how it can influence most effectively the course of events in this century, but not to live on myths and delusions. And I felt written in the faces of the Russian leaders some sort of sense they understood this as well, but were trapped by their own rhetoric, their own history, their own power structure.
Robert.
But no answer.
No. I think answer is more of the same, really, for some time.
Если Путин не дал, то как?
Да, мы же не можем, да, если
Because if Putin, as Yura says, didn't give you an answer, then what do you expect from us? What can we do? But now we'll try to deliberate on it as far as we can. So please remember to give your names. Good day. Sergei Tserekhin, a graduate of 2010. Mr. Skidelsky, Lord Skidelsky, in your presentation you said that you could see from the side of Russia a danger that Ukraine will leave towards Europe and we shall lose an ally. That was obvious, but what you didn't mention is that, I may be slightly misquoting you here, but as you said, there were no reasons for NATO to expand to include Ukraine. If you will, may I let you show a website, Goszakupki, American Procurement Agency website. In the meantime, I'll tell my colleagues what it's all about, and then I'll ask you a question. Well, at this website, they posted information about the reconstruction of the school number 5 in Sevastopol. Then it was the territory of Ukraine. It's a public offer dated September 2012. And it's quite possible that maybe this was one of the steps, or maybe exactly the step, which could be traced by the Russian Federation and perceived by the Russian Federation as grabbing, well, in inverted commas, of the territory of Ukraine, capture, a domination of US with a further placement of NATO troops that will be brought into the country, NATO bases in Sevastopol. So what is your take on this? This public offer to restructure the American government procurement side. And I also have another question to you. In terms of Russian mentality, what our mentality tells us, or maybe the answer to your question, maybe, or rather, let you answer first question and then I'll continue with the second question.
Do continue your question.
Okay, thank you. Вторая часть вопроса.
Part two of the question, according to, as to the Russian mentality. What we call Russians are very slow to harness a horse, but then they drive very fast, ride very fast. Don't you feel that we tolerated with sort of clenched our teeth by all the time while NATO was expanding towards the borders of the Russian Federation and the customs union, former borders of the Soviet Union, whatever name you may call it by, but still it was NATO expansion towards the east, the expansion of the EU that was getting closer to our borders of the former Soviet Union, to the borders of the today's Russian Federation. Maybe Russians waited for so long, and now we think we're dealing back a blow, well, again, in inverted commas.
This particular thing about the reconstruction of this school in Sevastopol, because I don't know the detail. I never comment on something just on the basis of one. I'd need to know a lot more in order to comment on this particular thing. All I want to say is that I've always been against the expansion of NATO eastward. I thought it was a big mistake. And I've been very much on the Russian side. There should have been a new security system worked out for the whole of Europe after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. And that would have been the right thing to do. But nevertheless, some of the new states asked to be members of NATO, particularly the Baltic states, and they were accepted. I think that was a mistake. NATO is a different issue from the European Union. You mustn't try and conflate these two things. You could, from a strategic point of view, you could regard the expansion of NATO as being a threat to Russia. It could be seen that way. But the expansion of the European Union isn't. The European Union is an economic association, primarily. It hasn't got a central government. It hasn't got a central army. And it's a sort of, it can't be regarded as against Russia in any way. If Russia joined the European Union or wanted to join the European Union, it would get a lot of economic benefits from doing so. But, you know, so don't confuse NATO and the European Union. They're very, very different things. And I think people make the mistake of lumping them together.
Да, если позволите, я чуть-чуть уточню.
If you will, I will make my clarification. What I didn't mean, it's not that there is an aggression and we perceive it like aggression. The aggression of what NATO does and the EU does. What I meant, in Russia, any movement towards our borders is perceived as a defeat. We perceive it as a deceit. We Russians, ethnic Russians, perceive it as a defeat, as a threat, I would put it this way, and as this aggressive response to somebody getting near to our borders.
I accept that as a description of the perception, but is it a correct perception? And should we not argue against it? Some bits of the perception may be correct, but most of it is not correct, is it? I mean, if someone says to you, look, the expansion of the European Union eastwards is a threat to Russia, you have to say, in what sense is it a threat? In what exactly is the threat that it contains? That is the subject of, I think, good, alert, civic citizenship, to always answer those sort of questions with a reasonable answer. That's what I think we need, not just acceptance of the perception. But I accept what you're saying is probably descriptively accurate.
Евгений Коноплев, Москва.
Evgeny Konoplev from Moscow. So please, I'm sorry. I'll give the floor to... I'm sorry, something is being said off the mic. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the possibility to look into those spheres and find out about the conversations that are at a level which most of us most probably will never get to. You were saying that as you shared your story about the talks with Vladimir Putin, and this since this thought that many Western leaders and intellectuals, they cannot somehow find common language with Vladimir Putin. They're already speaking such different languages that it's impossible to understand each other, one another. In your perception, in your feeling, is there anybody right now in the West, be it in the West or be it in Asia or be it among people who are around Putin, those who can talk to him and indeed get the message across, this viewpoint that is different from his viewpoint, to get this sort of across to him? Do you believe these people are still around?
Probably there are. I mean, I think there's no one in the West no leader in the West who feels they can talk to Putin any longer. I think his main sort of ally was obviously Angela Merkel, but she can't talk to him anymore. She said so. I mean, the estrangement goes back, it's a silly story which you probably all know of. She's very frightened of dogs, and the first time she had a meeting with Putin, the dog came into the room alone, and anyway, it didn't get off to a good start. But nevertheless, they did talk on a lot. But over the Ukrainian crisis, they talked a lot. But she said, "I can't talk to him anymore. He's delusional." That was the word she used. He's delusional. So I think that is a very big blow, because she actually had, Germany and Russia were the closest of the allies, or the closest partners in this whole setting. I don't think he can talk to Obama any longer, but maybe Obama's only 2 years to go, but I mean, he can't talk to Obama, and he can't talk to anyone in the UK. He can talk to the Chinese, he can talk to the Latin Americans, he can talk to North Korea. There are countries he can talk to, sure, but not the ones that perhaps of most interest to us here. In Russia itself, there must be people, even in the circle of the president, who want to say, look, we need to have a rethink about these things, because we're in a bit of a dead end now. And there must be some, whether they can say it, whether they feel that they're able to say it. You see, I had great hopes in Medvedev at one time. I thought he could be a counter to Putin, but I was wrong. I think he couldn't be. He didn't have the strength of character to be honest with Vladimir Putin. So the answer is, I'm afraid I'm rather depressed. I don't think anyone does at the moment. Maybe someone in the army, it's very hard to say. I wouldn't like to speculate. I don't know enough about how the Putin system is organized internally. What I do know, because this was also said at Sochi, but I mean everyone knows this, that the decision to annex Crimea was taken by about 3 people in isolation, suddenly, and without any consultation with the economic ministries. The economic ministries were not asked. They weren't asked to do an evaluation of the economic consequences of that decision. So it's a very, very, very close circle.
Женя.
Господин Скидельский.
Lord Skidelsky, thank you very much. Evgeny Konoplев from Moscow. Thank you very much for your efforts, which are sure are obvious to everybody. I want to say that if this effort is called by a word useful idiot, then I would be felt it is an honor to stand next to you among useful idiots. I suppose there are many harmful idiots right now. I'm not criticizing only my country alone. What I meant here at this seminar, I had a professional talk about media with representatives of foreign media who were criticizing, for example, other foreign media that refused to travel to the Rostov region that was organized by the Russian Foreign Ministry. And it was not the Russian media, it was media from other countries who were saying, as they criticized their peers and colleagues, they were saying it's wrong, it's not correct to refuse to use any opportunity to see it with your own eyes, to listen, to hear, and to voice your opinion and have a dialogue. So I'll have 3 points. First point. Point number 2, I want to tell you, maybe to all, it's my personal opinion, I'm not speaking on behalf of all Russians, I'm speaking in my own capacity. I want to thank you. Do not trust anybody who will tell you today on behalf of all Russians. All Russians do not know what is going on. We are arguing in our own kitchens, we are quarreling, we are debating, discussing, sometimes even quarrels and fighting with fists, sometimes intellectually, but nobody has the right to speak on behalf of all Russians. And point 3, you produced a vast impression on me in July, as I asked a question and quoted Chekhov. In answer, I found another quotation from Chekhov, regrettably, from another story about Chekhov. Regrettably, in the 5 months that passed since then, much has changed in my country, and when yesterday you asked me, or us, a group, did we see Leviathan, and did we like it? I must say, regrettably, yes, I know about this film. I know it's plot, but I can't answer you in a peer because I haven't seen it, and I cannot give you my take on this. Now, after all this alarmed speech, as my wise friends teach me to find positive things about everything, I want to thank you in person to the Minister of Culture of the Russian Federation, Mr. Medinsky, to make sure to watch this film. I will certainly travel to London, where I shall watch it, and very much thank you. Thank you. Continue those efforts which you called by saying useful idiot, and we shall continue them on that without betraying our country, taking care of it and trying to preserve these links between the two countries. Disagreeing, but arguing, debating, discussing, but building those connections.
Knew this later on today in the Izbushka.
Женя, ты наше лекарство. Пожалуйста, ваш вопрос.
Zhenya, you are just like a medicine for us. Yeah, Zhenya, please. Ksenia Batanova, Moscow. I would like to join what Zhenya said. I always feel unpleasant when they say we Russians, we all have different opinions, and I never responded to the expansion of NATO and to the expansion of the EU. I don't quite understand what the expansion of EU means. There are countries that were always close to Russia, next to Russia. Now maybe they have some special economic relations, I don't know, maybe somebody will support us, Zhenya. Let's refrain from such just generalizations when we speak about political decisions that were made by politicians and not by us. And let us change the subject here. As to Eurasia, you asked a question, whether it is a myth or not. Well, just recent news about relations with Belarus and Kazakhstan, general economic or single economic space. We see that Russia bans import of food products from Belarus because Russia feels that goods from Europe are imported through Belarus and Kazakhstan, and that's why we just shut borders even for goods from Kazakhstan. So much for the single trade space. Thank you.
Very telling. I mean, this is what happens. Of course, you can't have a customs union in which you ban various goods from members of the union. That's not going to be a customs union, and that dilemma will persist as long as sanctions continue, and sanctions will continue until there's some settlement in the Ukraine, and there's not very much settlement in the Ukraine in sight at the moment. So the customs union is more or less aborted until, this is... But there shouldn't be a separate customs union of Eurasia and the European Union. There should be big associations of trade and commerce between the two groups.
Да. Ваш вопрос. Потом Никита.
Kristina Brovkova from Tyumen. Lord Skidelsky, thank you very much for your insight from Valdai, and I'd like to respond to your query whether the citizens of Russia, whether we see a threat on the political level. I want to say that Russia, as a community of citizens, we do not see a threat in Europe, in the West. Just a simple example, people continue to travel, people have some property, people buy things there, people communicate, get education there. For example, Margarita Simonyan mentioned that she took part in the school program, the exchange of US, and you were saying that people at every level invest into UK. So Russia, like citizens, they do not see any threat in Europe, but Russia as a political regrettably does see, and for this reason, the question is, don't you feel that in this situation it's a kind of crisis in the relations, that Europe and the US do not know how to deal with this new Russia?
Of course, that's true. I think the Russian. I heard very much what you said. You should not talk about a monolithic Russian view about things, that's the impression the leaders of Russia give. And of course, when you see that you have 80% or 85% support for Putin in the public opinion polls, you start thinking, well, maybe he has got 85% of the country thinking the same way. I know you shouldn't, but it's just, simple as that. Where I think the Russians have made a great mistake in foreign policy is not to understand that Europe and America are not the same thing. There is a European view on things which is not the American view. And again, you can't generalize. Some bits of Europe are closer to the Americans than others. For example, Poland is American. It's an American colony, basically, for various reasons, which is it hates Russia. I mean, it's very, and that was, of course, symbolized in the person of its foreign minister, Radek Sikorski. Now, but Germany isn't like that. Actually, for some reason, Germany and Russia should have many more reasons, but because maybe they fought each other so savagely, they're actually quite close. It's been the warmest relationship of Russia with a European country since the fall of communism. And even before then, Ostpolitik, it all started in the 70s with the Soviet Union still in existence. They didn't exploit that, the Russians, enough, that closeness with Germany. Instead, gradually, they sort of, got the whole of the West in one camp, which was an achievement, a quite considerable achievement in catastrophe, really. Anyway, this was just by way of comment on your question, but I agree with what you said.
Tuva Republic. So it's not even a question, but it's a small comment, if I may. Will you agree with me or not? I don't know. It's in Russia, almost everyone understands. Russians and Russians, non-Russians, they all understand that the sly Asians, very difficult, very scared to do business with sly Asians. That's why I hope that eventually we turn around and will face Europe eventually, and will go to Europe rather than to the East.
And I'm not going to comment on it.
Accept it.
Accept it.
Но скажу вам, что Роберт родился.
But I can tell you that Robert was born in China. I can tell you by way of information. Yeah, yes, he was born in China. So much for sly Asians. Because his family fled Russia during the revolution. So he speaks Russian only to his close friends. To his close friends. Да. Nikita Molchakov, Moscow. It's not so much a question, but a comment, and it has to do with the beginning of your presentation. What's the issue? What to do in modern world? So this issue, I think, it has to do with fundamental issues of modern relations. And what is it? This is that we have a gigantic divide between the practices and the regulatory framework. And so because the 1945 rules of the game that all the international relations should be played out, now they have long since become obsolete because they do not correspond to the new reality. Right, and so then the UN Principles Charter, for example, the integrity, sovereignty, and so this regulatory framework is there, but there are some rogue states, and there are some failed states, etc. And it's not there. It was not in the cards at that time. And the Arab Springs, starting from that, and all the way up with the modern events in Ukraine, all that bespeak that. And there's a proof of that. And so what do we need? Do we need to create new framework, new regulations, or reform old rules, or just leave everything as it is? I don't know. Yes, in my view, the question has to do with the regulatory framework, norms, standards, and because sometimes, so if you violate a certain regulatory framework, it may be good or bad. And by the way, so the example of the European Union, creation of the European Union is a good example when they went away from the standard of the World War II system of peace, because they violated and eventually got the EU. And so then the Arabian events and the Ukrainian events. So that could be kind of deviation from the standard, and maybe we need to put up this new regulatory framework. So we need just to sit at the negotiating table and create the new rules of the game that would be more adaptable, adjustable, and they would conform to the new reality. Otherwise, so we'll eventually come up to the against a war against everybody.
That's a very deep question, and it's also a very extensive question. You're right. I mean, the basis on which the United Nations Charter was agreed was the right of every nation who is a member of the UN to be protected against any foreign invasion, and so the use of force was authorized was confined to the use of force authorized by the Security Council in Article 7, and that could only be authorized if the nation concerned was a threat to the peace of the world and was doing something, an aggressive act. The right of self-defense was preserved. Now, all that has shifted, I mean, for a number of reasons. I mean, one is the growth of transnational terrorism. That was not there. I mean, things like a jihad, a sort of a terrorist or an attack across lots of national frontiers simultaneously. Through a new caliphate or something like that. That is the Muslim factor in world politics was not there in 1945. That's developed since then. Secondly, the increasing concern of the West in particular with the defense of human rights and democracy as justifying a state's existence. In other words, the fact that a state is there in historic frontiers does not give it the right to exist if it massacres lots of its own people and sends many of them and many others become refugees. That state, I mean, in the way modern jurisprudence in the West, at any rate, is developing, does not have a right to be protected in its frontiers against foreign intervention. And so I think the idea of the bad state or the rogue state was born which should be deprived of the protections of the UN, even though it was a member of the UN. And I think, you can see why that extension to the old 1945 doctrine developed, but it's quite dangerous because, in a way, it gives carte blanche almost to intervene whenever you want to. And these interventions are often not very successful. In fact, in the Middle East, you get this problem. Would it have been better to leave Saddam Hussein in power? He wasn't much of a threat by that time to anyone else. He was a great threat to his own people, or some of them. Would it have been better to leave him there? Or was it the right thing to remove him? I was against the invasion of Iraq. I think he should be left there under tight external constraint, and he'll die in 10 years, and that'll be the end of him. But, that was a minority in England. So I think these are very serious questions that you ask, and we have to rethink this. Is it the duty to protect is a function that the UN has assumed as a strict derivation from Catholic just war theory? You can see how that simply goes in. And at the time when Catholic theory, social international relations theory was developed, there were no states, there were no nation states, you see. It was a universal obligation. So we have to get back to that, but at the same time, not in a way that gives some people simply the right to impose a new empire on everyone in the name of human rights.
Ekaterina Lushnikova, Vyatka. So you spoke that Putin looks like an abandoned lover. And I think that Russian civilization and the state of Russia, to a certain extent, can be likened to this abandoned lover. So who are looking for love from the West, and so then there is no reciprocity, and it goes back in many centuries. Russia has been looking for love on the West part, and so there is this opposition for many years, because Russians, they wanted always this, they were longing for the West, and so some was saying that we need to sever Russia from the West. So then the role of Russia in the process of Western democracy.
I agree. I mean, you can trace this idea of being jilted by the West for centuries. But the Russians have always, I think, misunderstood the terms on which the West wanted them. You see, I mean, I referred to this earlier on. I mean, when Putin said, let's join together in this battle against Muslim fundamentalism, the Christian civilizations should join together against religious fundamentalism. That was wrong. I mean, the West would join against religious fundamentalism in the name of the Enlightenment, but not in the name of Christianity. And the problem is Russia was not offering Enlightenment thinking on this matter. It was offering some kind of religious identity. And so even right at that beginning point, there was some disagreement about the terms of the collaboration or the terms of the partnership between Russia and the West, even on the question of Islamic fundamentalism. In the name of what are you fighting Islamic fundamentalism? In whose name are you fighting it? In the name of a civic civilization or in the name of Christian beliefs? Now, I'm not saying they can't be reconciled, but that is a basic question. And I don't know what your answer to that is, but I just leave it there.
Немножко не о том вопросе.
And I was saying that Russia wanted, certainly, I don't want to talk on behalf of Russia, but Russia wanted to be accepted as a separate, standalone, unique civilization and be embraced by the West. And certainly, but Russia is accepted as a poor relative. That they despicable attitude. They don't want this poor relative in the West, and so this is for everyone. Okay, yeah, there's something that Robert has wanted to stress. Because we are talking, so when we are in the modern world and we are talking about the civilization and what and Russia is not thinking about this approach, civil civilization approach, because this civil civilization somehow concludes the epoch of enlightenment, which created the Western world with all these good and bad things and the criticism that exists of the West. So in all its entirety. This is point number one. And the second, so since we're talking about civilization, we need that the question of loving or not loving, it's not even there. Because people should love each other, specific people. Yeah, it's the terminology. No, it's not terminology. It's more than that. So I very often, it's not a question of terms. Always give an example, always, from Venice Kirafeev, famous Russian writer. So that's Moskva Petushki, his famous book, novel. And so when two drunk men in a cold car, so a railroad car, they are thinking about great things, about enlightening, about philosophical things, though they are surrounded by dirt. And they say, and one said, do they love us on the other side of the Pyrenean mountains? So the one drunk asks another drunk, do they love us or not? How can they not love us? And they are deliberating about these high things. And I think that this question should be taken off the agenda. But your question, certainly with our leader, comes to the question of love or not love. That's how, and the aloof West tells us. So what kind of partners are you? So what do you mean loving? So how can you keep your promise? So if you made a promise, keep your word, and then this emotion. So you need from emotions you move to go to a pragmatic, logical, communicative language, and not many are ready for that. But this is the future process, and there is nothing else we could offer now, So if you want to love someone, then you need to have much in common with the guy, and then you will come to love him. So good or bad, but partnership, that's the only way out. And so then approach is different. We see things at different angles, because love is something else. That's a different realm. And this is the wrong approach, because others don't look at it this way, like we look at it. Thank you. Thank you. Graduates of 2008. I could. Can we look at it from a different angle? I think that to isolate Russia, it won't work out anyway. It's impossible, and because even the history tells us that it's been impossible, and it's a question of time. And time is on our side. And I think that because I've never seen anything like this wonderful school inspired, and I think that we need just to we cannot possibly isolate our society, provided that we have such people like us, and we live here in this country, and being such people, so we cannot certainly everything will be fine. Eventually it will work out, and we'll understand each other. And Nadari is one of our best graduates, and our close friend, and our own personal friend. and we always invite Nadari to the seminar, and because Georgia doesn't need a visa like the British, yeah, you can imagine, yeah, they need a visa too, and some those who issue a visa, so that we're not going to give you a visa. Why you're not going to give me a visa? Because he will come, Nadari, who loves Russia so much. So they say, so he will go to Russia and he will tell bad things about Georgia. We're not going to issue you a visa. And it took us several days, yeah, to convince them to give a visa. And he was given a visa. And and when the seminar ends, so the visa expires, same minute. And so we don't want to give a visa because he will go back to Georgia and say bad things about Russia.
I want to make a comment on why do you think time is on our side? You said time is on our side. Why do you think time is on your side? Your and side.
No, I would say that time, because the time of this school, the time of these changes is our. So he spoke about the school. Okay, so the time of the school is on our side. Okay.
Спасибо, Надария. Пожалуйста, ваш вопрос.
Гапур Гайсулаев, Чеченская Республика. Для начала позвольте...
Chechen Republic. First, let me join my colleague and express very deep gratitude and respect for your position and so your outlook at the world policy. And thank you specifically for your point of view concerning Saddam Hussein. Now, question. Thank you for that stand. Usually, Putin in Valdai. And he met those who are referred to as non-systemic opposition. So he never did that. And don't you feel that the power so invites the opposition to such forums, to such places where they can deliberate, so to say, oh, you see, we've given them a chance to speak up, to work, to do something better, but they failed because they're weak. So maybe there is no sense to go to those Valdai forums because...
I think that's a tenable point of view. And I actually thought quite hard. But I think in the end, curiosity got the better of me. And also, I think something more genuine. I wanted to hear the Russian leaders' point of view from their own lips and see their faces as they told these things. So I think you sort of get some sense of how much they believed in them, how much stressed they were, and even if they give completely banal answers to your questions, there is a quality of banality which it varies. And you can also form judgments. But broadly speaking, they do not have people there who they can really argue with. It's very interesting. For example, on the platform with Putin, he had two leaders who said actually nothing. But one of them was Villepin, Dominique de Villepin, who was former Prime Minister of France. And another was a German former president of Germany, I think. But anyway, that was just to sort of suggest that he was keeping good company still, even though this company was sort of slightly out-of-date company. Should one go to Valdai or not? Of course, if you go to Valdai, you do not feel like starting a great big row when you're there. And the Westerners or the foreigners were much more willing to be critical than the Russians who were there. And a lot of some of the Russians would just sort of ask, kind of, "Oh, President Putin, you're so wonderful, and but we love you so much, and but there's maybe a little problem here. Could you, words of wisdom, could you tell us how you would resolve? You know, this kind of thing. These are Russian academics, terrible. Yeah, but the West don't do that. It's not our style. So, still, one day you will find that we won't want to come to Valde. I won't want to come to Valde. But as long as we're not at war, and God forbid we'd never have a war, we must keep communication open. That's absolutely essential. With whoever will talk, we want to talk. That's my view.
Сейчас я даю вам вопрос. Я только не понимаю, какую вы видите оппозицию.
But what kind of opposition did you see there? There was no opposition. I didn't see any member of the opposition in Valdai. So what's I was saying non-systemic opposition. I'm talking about that Voronezh. If I may, it's not so much a question. I would like to answer a question of Mr. Skidelsky. I wanted to ask concerning whether we, the Russians, think that America and European Union are attacking us. Can I answer? I cannot answer on behalf of all Russians. I can only on behalf of myself. And sociological polls prove that 84% of the Russians they support Ukrainian policy, Putin's policy against Ukraine, right? Maybe this is wrong, maybe this figure is very high, but I think it's close to true. So 84% support Putin on Ukraine. And I'm a representative, I'm one of those 84 possible percent of people who support Putin's Ukrainian policy, one of them. And I can try to explain why I support Putin's policy in Ukraine. I do not think that the United States and European Union are attacking Russia. I don't think so. And I don't think they are enemies of Russia. Moreover, I think that Ukraine and Russia should not fight each other. This war should not be there. And out of those 84%, the majority don't see any war between Russia and Ukraine. And they are categorically against any invasion of Russia in Ukraine. All against. But why I adhere this position concerning Putin's Ukrainian policy? The thing is that I'm 33. I was born in the Soviet Union. At school I was taught that my fatherland is the USSR. And my parents voted at the referendum to keep the integrity of the Soviet Union in 1991. And I was voting, I would put bulletins in the box, and I was only 10. I knew what I was voting for, so that was not me. But I was putting my mama's, papa's bulletins in the box. And for my parents, it was a big tragedy, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I took it as a tragedy as well. I was hurt. But I agree with Putin to the extent that the collapse of the Soviet Union is a catastrophe, geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And with regards to Ukrainian conflict, so what happened there as I view it? So if I may say so, the president of one country says he is a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. So he was taken away from power, right? He was dethroned, and certainly he should have been dethroned. He should have been. And so there were many instruments. He could have been impeached, so he could have ended up his term, and then with the help of democratic elections just to vote for another. And so then there would have been no violence. So it would have peacefully, he would have sit out his term, and then another one would have been elected. But instead of that, so the West provided moral support, at least, to this uprising and to this dethronement by non-democratic and illegitimate means. And so when they removed Yanukovych from power, and that certainly elicits in many Russians, so they feel their feelings are hurt, and so they're hurt, and I think that what Putin did, this accession of Crimea, is not Putin's position, because he even didn't care whether Crimea would be part of Russia or not, but he needed to increase his ratings. And he tried to increase his rating by adding Crimea to Russia. And he succeeded. and many Russians think that way. So I try to explain my my view of why it happened. Everyone has a right to his or her opinion. This is right. But there is an order of things that we need to follow. And if we want to give an argument that would support another point of view, then we need to just argue and not to make partial conclusions.
Can I make in reply? I think maybe it's wrong to emphasize the legality of the change of regime too much. In fact, very few regimes that are unpopular, deeply unpopular, and where there's no proper electoral process, peacefully overcome. The impeachment of Yanukovych was carried by 328 votes to 0. No doubt under pressure, and it was 10 short of what was required to get rid of him permanently. Now, if one bases a whole policy on that narrow thread of how Yanukovych was actually got rid of, it looks very thin, really. Because, as you said, he should have gone anyway, and if he'd had 10 more votes behind the impeachment, then everything would have been just as all right. It would have been fine, and we wouldn't have been in this situation. But as soon as you put it that way, it looks very, very implausible, doesn't it? It didn't hinge on this narrow legal point. It really hinged on whether you thought that this regime was being overthrown by a popular uprising, or whether you thought there was a coup d'etat initiated by fascists and nationalists against the support of the population. And I think the first is much more plausible event. How it was actually done, we know revolutions don't follow a script written by lawyers. That's obvious. Anyway, sorry.
Я вижу, Лен, я сейчас, пожалуйста. Одну секундочку, там была рука, и потом вы. Пожалуйста, да.
Good evening. I'm Alexei Abanin. I'm from Moscow. Mr. Skidelsky, I would like to ask a question which I already asked yesterday evening, but I would very much like to hear an answer here in this hall. We know that in the second half of the 20th century, when the new Europe was being born, and the migration processes played a very important role. And the so-called multiculturalist policy played also an important role, which in a way was abandoning by the European states of integration or attempts to integrate. Multiculturalism as a policy was being perpetrated for about 50 years, and many political figures and public figures in France, Britain and Germany eventually confessed that this policy failed because many immigrant communities in Europe failed to integrate. And today they pose a quite significant problem in terms of social and cohesion. So what do you believe that the multicultural policy of multiculturalism did fail, first of all, and how should Europe react to that? Well, Alexei, first of all, let us congratulate you on your birthday today. And then why are you so militant about this? Discussions. You should be probably calm. No, I understand that you're excited, but I think that you should. Yeah, happy birthday anyway.
Were you excited? It didn't come across in the translation anyway. No, I think, just very briefly, first of all, I think in thinking about problems of migration, you have to distinguish between multiculturalism and integration. They're two different concepts. And the French have always believed in integration. If you're a Frenchman, if you adopt French habits, French morals, and French language, and speak French like a Frenchman, you're a Frenchman. And that was their aim in their immigration policy. British and others thought more in terms of multiculturalism, which was having separate communities that would be more, they would have a lot of interaction, but they would retain their distinctive identities and so on, and they wouldn't be forced to become like Englishmen. So you've got two concepts there, how you do it. The main issue in all this is not integration versus multiculturalism, but how open borders should be to immigration. That's really been the issue behind the immigration debate. How is it viable to have open immigration, the right for anyone in the European Union, and remember the European Union may be extended, to live anywhere and work anywhere in the European Union? That was a right. It's in the Maastricht Treaty, and it's part of the setting up of the single market. But most people in Europe have never accepted it, and that is then a big disjunction between the elites who make the policy and people who vote, and that's why you have extremist politics. So we have to think about this very carefully and without prejudice, and it's simply a question of how you govern a society to the benefit or with the acquiescence of most of its people. I think it can be done, but I think you need to talk about it generally. But it's the numbers that are coming in to the European Union and moving within the European Union that is the problem, not the issue of multiculturalism versus integration. Because people will do this in different ways.
Спасибо. Так, пожалуйста, под Леночку.
Vladimir Nabata from Ulyanovsk. Mr. Skidelsky. Let us imagine for a moment that you're a magician and that you can influence the geopolitical processes. Then my first question would be, could you draw an image of Russia in the future in that way which you would have liked to see? And how much of a difference shall we see between that image and probably the image conceived by the political elite in the West?
I would like to see no significant barrier to the communication of Russians with the rest of Europe. No significant barriers. I don't want there to be economic barriers. I don't want there to be cultural barriers. I want everyone who wants to and who can to learn Russian just as much as Russians should learn another language. I think Russia has always had a great contribution to make to European civilization. I mean, European civilization without Russia is inconceivable to me. It doesn't exist. I mean, Russia has done a major contribution to European culture, European civilization. A great deal of our cultural diet is based on Russian literature, Russian music, Russian art. And the idea of politicians separating what ought not to be separated is, to me, absolutely tragic and mad. At the same time, I don't want everything distinctive in the cultures of Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Italy, Spain to be submerged into some common pot of a very thin set of values, which we're all asked to sign up to. I mean, that's not the way to do it. But Yeah, I despair of politicians a lot of the time. I mean, they're there for one reason only. There's only one reason why you need politicians, and that is because of the belief that if they weren't there, people would be fighting each other the whole time. That is the only justification of politics whatsoever. We have to have this inconvenient class of people in charge to stop people killing each other. Now, if on the other hand, they do encourage people to kill each other, then they have no justification at all. But a lot of politicians stir things up instead of cooling things down, which is what they need to do. They need to cool popular passions, not inflame them. And, I think we have to have a better type of politician. We have to have change of leadership in Russia, certainly. We have to have a change of system.
What are you saying here?
Well, what am I saying? I'm saying what I think. Change of leadership in Russia. I'm not saying now, at this moment in time, but one's got to reconfigure this system. And I'm also saying we have to have a change in leadership in many Western countries, so that we can get politicians who are able to conduct a civilized dialogue together. Otherwise, there's no hope. Sorry, I mustn't be understood. I'm not advocating that any revolution. I'm saying we've got to have a system which can get good people who can talk to each other in a civilized way into power.
Леночка, пожалуйста.
Спасибо. Елена.
Yelena Rukavishnikova from Moscow, alumnus of 2007. I lived in Sochi for 4 years, and we were getting prepared for the Olympics. Thousands of visitors came to Sochi during the Olympics. It was a great source of pride, not to show Sochi, not only to show Sochi, but also, and I was lucky to work with the foreign media, and probably some of the most demanding journalists became our best friends. I trust in the horizontal ties, and we are friends with our colleagues in this Olympic month, in spite of what is happening in the world. And I support Natalia in her statement that school is much needed today. Any international events critical, which are in times of crisis or prosperity, if I'm ready to continue this dialogue, to do this with an open heart, this is our chance for the future, and it's a personal choice. I think that the most important thing today is to hold the responsibility, to assume it. I'm Alyona Alyoshina from Khabarovsk. Do you believe that people on the square, let us Maidan or the Bolotnaya Square or the Beijing Square, Tiananmen Square, go out, start to the streets, not because they are tempted to, that they have an inner desire, but because they're getting an internet mail or some sort of an internet Facebook message. There's a version that people in the Bolotnaya Square during the recent rallies in Beijing went to the streets not because they wanted to, but because they were called there. The Americans, why? I don't know. Lena says,
You can't separate it, can you? I mean, people are not atoms, individualistic atoms, so that one day one person feels, I must go into the street, and look, there's another person. What a coincidence. It doesn't happen like that. They're always mobilized. There's some mobilization. It used to be the newspapers, it used to be public orators, now it's the internet. So But what I'm saying is that the internet can't get you out onto the streets if you don't want to, if it doesn't tell you something that you know you want to do. I mean, it may be that the internet can say, why don't we all do this? And then no one does it, because they don't want to do it. It doesn't appeal to them. So you always have to have something that the internet can play on in order to get action. Does that answer the question? I think in a way you've posed an unreal opposition between individual and social. In fact, all behavior is a combination of both, and the internet is a form of social mobilization, which replaces previous forms of social mobilization, which always existed. No? Not right? Okay.
Пожалуйста.
Кристина Боровкова, Тюмень, извиняюсь за...
Christina Borovkov from Tyumen. I'm sorry if I'm repeating somebody, that we spoke about the social poles, but I would like to be heard. We have very good social poles and sociological instruments, but many polls are conducted to understand which of the viewpoints is dominant in the society, A, B, or C. But if most mass media project only a viewpoint A, then all social polls do not so much show the true thoughts of people, but what has been broadcasted. And in many ways, social polls only reflect the TV. So it really is a problem to try and understand what the citizens really think.
Pluralism, a pluralist press, pluralist parties. Otherwise, you don't know what the support really is for any particular policy, because you haven't had the debate first. It's the support after the debate that is crucial.
Я хочу просто добавить,
Перевод шел, ты уже...
I would like to add, I asked an intellectual, a Bulgarian, Ivan Krastev, who visited a Valdai Club forum with Robert, a very fine intellectual who lives in Vienna. I asked him, Ivan, what happened in the West with such a reaction to the Crimean events? And he said everything happened as early as Georgia, because the Russian army could have well gotten to Tbilisi. And if I I can quote his answer. After the war, and I also remember the Kosovo incident, the long period of discussions and debates, what is to be done, what was to be done, and the word genocide, the term started to be used, and the ethnic cleansings were condemned. There was no genocide in Crimea. And Ivan Krastev said to me, now I hope to hear Robert's comment. He said, when World War I erupted, people created borders to complete the nation-state building. During World War II, people were trying to hold to their borders, and they were ready to relocate whole peoples. And the post-Cold War period, especially in Europe, in the European civilization, people in Europe at least think about the transparency of borders, which means only one thing. While you are within your national boundaries, it is important to create within the countries democratic culture and social arrangements whereby people, goods and capitals can move freely. And the reaction to the Crimean events was so harsh because in particular Germany and other states suddenly saw the nightmare ghost of redrawing the borders. I think that it is quite persuasive, this viewpoint. Russia wants to and is building managed democracy, but I don't think it would work. If it is democracy, then it is familiar to everybody. If it is not, then it is not a democracy, which is also a very well-known social arrangements. And I hope that the future generations must try, while they are in the national borders, they must become and must try to become transparent with all the democratic institutes which are imminent to such transparency. In this, I think we would see a new global society. It's a long path, but it is at least a goal. Whereas getting back to the archaic social arrangements is not worth it, because by cultivating and by bringing back the ghosts of history, first of all, we have not witnessed most of the events that we read about in the history textbooks, and in the social constructs, progress is a factor. And Europe went through a period of lived through this progress, and so I think that Russia must have a project to co-participate it, and this project is called Europe. Eurasia is a territory. It is not a spirit. I often say, and I think I'm right, if you ask a Chinese person or a Japanese person, would they like to see Russia as a Eurasian or an Asiatic culture or a country? I do not think so. Vladivostok and Khabarovsk, as they are today, are European cities with the entire set of values, relations, and attitudes with respect to life and death. This is very different from China. One can be partner with China, that's fine, but I think that the vector is different. I would like to thank you, Robert. We have given you 2 hours, more than any expert has been given, and I would like to thank you not just for this presentation, but to thank all of you for this presentation. Thank you for conducting this, and thank you for this event in the life of the school. We shall come back at 5. Thank you.